Welcome to our video lecture on topic 4.1, species, communities, and ecosystems. Our objectives, we're going to define a lot of words. We're going to define some more words. And then when we define speciation, we're going to talk about different ways that can happen, different modes of reproductive isolation. We're going to outline quadrat sampling. We're going to define more words, lots of different kinds of symbiosis, what even are trophic levels. We're going to distinguish between more vocabulary, Detritivore and Saprotroph, and then we're going to wrap up with a tiny little discussion on nutrient cycles and sustainability. Our essential understanding for today, the continued survival of living organisms, including us humans, depends on sustainable communities. And our first big vocab of the day, species. Species are groups of organisms that can potentially interbreed, make babies together to produce fertile babies. Fertile means that those babies can have babies. So lots of examples of species. One amazing example. So birds of paradise, there are 41 different species of birds of paradise. They have lots of similarities. They definitely have common ancestors, but 41 different species, they interbreed only with themselves to produce fertile offspring. Interbreeding is that breeding within your species. Crossbreeding is when organisms breed outside their species, so between two members of different species. In these instances, the offspring are almost always infertile. For example, if a horse and a donkey, two different species, breed, we get mules, but mules cannot have babies, so the only way that we get mules is to breed horses and donkeys. Vocab word number 2, population. Population is a group of organisms in the same species, same area, same time. So same species, same area, same time. We could talk about the population of humans in Denton High School. We could talk about the population of magnolia trees outside Denton High School. This is going to be a population. What's kind of cool about our populations is that we can actually make new populations. So members of a species might be reproductively isolated into separate populations. We have lots of ways of isolating organisms reproductively. Isolation in this instance means that they can no longer interbreed. So something is preventing organisms from making babies together. And over time, this could lead to new species. We'll talk more about that on the next slide. There are a couple different ways that we can isolate these populations into new populations. One way, the way that probably makes the most sense, is geographic isolation, which we also can call allopatric speciation, making new species allopatric. Allo, allá in Spanish, over there, la in French, there. So allopatric, where we have a here and we have a there. So something geographically, land, an earthquake, a river, something has happened to separate one group into two new groups. We have separate populations. This is geographic isolation. These guys and these guys can no longer interbreed. They're not going to make babies together anymore. All these other ways of isolation are known as sympatric. Sim is together, so they're going to still be in the same area, but something is preventing them from interbreeding. So even though they might be near each other, they're not having babies together. One way is temporal. Temp means time. And so we might have one group that is diurnal. They're awake during the day. We have one group that is nocturnal, awake at night. They are never going to meet each other. We might have organisms that go into heat in the spring, or other organisms that go into heat in the fall. They are not going to mate because they mate at different times of the year, in different seasons. Ecological isolation is kind of similar to geographic. These guys are in the same place, but they're inhabiting different niches within that same space. We might have geckos, and some of them live high on a tree. This is a tree, by the way. We might have some geckos that live high up on branches of trees. We might have geckos that live down on the ground cover under the tree. And these guys, even though they're in the same place, kind of, sort of, near the same tree, the guys that stay in the branches, the guys that stay under the trees are never going to meet to make babies. Behavioral isolation, we're going to look at some videos in class about different mating behaviors of birds of paradise, those amazing birds, 41 different species of birds of paradise. We're going to look at some of their mating rituals. There are dances, there are songs, there are all kinds of cool things that will attract some mates and repel some other mates. So behavioral isolation, basically mating rituals that are going to either attract or repel the potential for a mate. Last up, This one's kind of awkward. Mechanical isolation. This is just where pieces and parts simply don't fit well together. So on that last slide, we talked about the potential for speciation, new species developing over time. This idea of speciation is basically where we have those two separate populations, and they could have been isolated geographically or behaviorally, temporally. So these two separate populations of the species over time, lots and lots and lots of time, might accumulate significant mutations that make them very different. At that point, they might no longer be able to interbreed. Even if they met each other and tried, it wouldn't work. And this process is known as speciation. Speciation is the formation of new and distinct species in the course of evolution. Super great, amazing example of speciation are Darwin's finches here. We call them Darwin's finches because he went to the Galapagos Islands and noticed that there were lots of different kinds of finches. So these guys all had a common ancestor. They started taking advantage of different food sources, and that led to the accumulation of mutations. Some organisms had a mutation that allowed them to take advantage of a certain food group, and so they made lots of babies that were different from the babies that these guys made, right? So these guys are like cracking open nuts and eating those. These guys might be picking little bugs out of trees. Next vocab word of the day, community. So we talked about species, groups of organisms that can interbreed. We talked about populations. That's a shortcut for population, P-O-P-N. So populations are groups of the same species in the same space at the same time. Most of the time, we're going to have lots of different populations in the same space at the same time, and that's what a community is. So a community is all of the populations of different species that are living together at the same place, same time, and interacting with each other. So we can talk about the community of organisms in the field outside Denton High School. We have grass, and we have birds, and we have trees, and we have ants, and we have mice, and sometimes we have humans. So that's going to be the community, all the different populations in the same space at the same time. Us species, we definitely are dependent on each other, lots of relationships with other species in order for us to stay alive. And we're going to talk about this magical thing called the food web in a couple more slides. One way that we can study communities, those groups of populations, the group of the same species in the same area at the same time. A way for us to study communities and populations is this super cool thing called quadrat sampling. And you might be thinking, ooh, Lens, typo, that should be quadrant, because in math we have quadrants. Actually, in science, we do not have an N. They are quadrats, quadrat sampling. So what we're going to do in quadrat sampling is we're going to throw down this amazing grid onto the area that we want to study. And we're just going to randomly pick a couple squares. Maybe I pick this one, and I pick this one, and this one, and this one. And then what I do is I study just what's in these specific quadrats that I am sampling. I can count the blades of grass, I can count the dandelions, the roly-polies, whatever else might be in here, and then I can make some generalizations. I can assume that what is in these random samples is probably what is representative of the whole entire thing. Because the idea of counting every single dandelion, every single blade of grass, every single roly-poly in that whole entire space, that's a little intimidating, right? So here we have an example of quadrat sampling that has some data in it. Let's see what kind of math we can do with this data. First up, average. We can calculate average number of organisms in each quadrant. Average, as always, is going to be the sum of the data divided by the number of pieces of data. 3 plus 4 is 7, plus 5 is 12, plus 5 is 17, plus 8 gives us a grand total of 25 organisms divided by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 quadrants. That's going to give us an average of 5 organisms per quadrant. If each quadrant has an area of 1 by 1 meter, so 1 meter by 1 meter. What is the population density in organisms? Slashy bar, meters squared, organisms per meter. Remember that slashy bar is the same thing as a fraction bar. It means divided by. So total number of organisms per quadrat, we decided the average was 5 organisms divided by the area. 1 times 1 is 1 square meter per quadrat. And so our population density in organisms, 5 per square meter. 5 divided by 1 is 5. 5 organisms per meter squared. So let's predict the total number of organisms in the whole entire area. This one, I know that I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 meters going up and down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 meters going across. So I have 25 total meters squared. If I have 5 organisms per square meter, then I'm going to have a total of 125 organisms statistically predicting in our whole entire area. So those populations that we're counting in our quadrats are going to interact with other populations in their communities, and those interactions we can refer to as symbiosis. Sim is together and bio is life, living. So these are things that are living together. Be careful, don't confuse this with the thing that we learned, endosymbiotic theory. Endosymbiosis, this is where they were living together inside each other. That theory of the evolution of eukaryotic cells when bacteria that were really good at doing photosynthesis got eaten by other cells and then they evolved over lots of time into chloroplasts. We are not talking about endosymbiosis here, just symbiotic relationships, symbiosis. A couple different kinds. We're going to look at predation. Predation where we have something is a good and something is a really bad. Parasitism, another, something gets a good and the other thing is a bad. Commensalism is kind of weird. So something gets a good and the other one is totally neutral. We don't even care. Whatever, do your thing. Mutualism, this is where both organisms benefit from the relationship. So I want us to guess. These guys, I've got some clownfish and some sea anemones. What kind of relationship do we think this is? This is mutualism. The stinging cells of the sea anemones don't bother the clownfish. The clownfish are actually protected from their predators by those sea anemones. And then the clownfish, they're not super tidy eaters. And so when they eat food, sometimes little droplets of food fall out their mouths, which is snacks for the sea anemones. This guy, I've got some orchids growing up here in the trees. What do we think? You might be thinking parasitism. It is not actually parasitism. This one is, oh, that's a bad color. We cannot see that. This one is commensalism. This one is commensalism. So most orchids are what we call epiphytes. So they live on other trees, but they don't actually take any nutrients from the trees. They take nutrients from air and rain and maybe some organisms, some debris that is left behind around them. But they're not actually removing any nutrients from the tree. They're just sitting on top of the tree. The tree doesn't even care. Nothing is happening negatively to the tree. So this is commensalism, where the orchids have a positive benefit and the tree doesn't even care. It is neither helped nor harmed. How about this example? Oh, that beautiful little ladybug. What is she doing? Oh my goodness. This is the fierce predator, the ladybug. She is noshing down on that aphid. So this is an example of predation. Ladybugs are serious carnivores. I don't know if you knew that or not, but ladybugs are predators. They eat aphids. Aphids are basically the mosquitoes of plants. So aphids do the same thing to plants that mosquitoes do to us. And so gardeners will sometimes buy huge numbers of ladybugs. By the way, you can buy ladybugs on Amazon.com. So you can get a bunch of ladybugs and just dump them in your garden, and they will eat up all these aphids that are destroying your roses. So this is an example of predation. The ladybug has a positive consequence. She gets a snack. The aphid dies. That's bad. How about this relationship? What do we think this one is? This one is mutualism. So there is a mutual benefit. The hummingbird here gets a snack of nectar, but when the hummingbird puts its nose into that crazy long flower, a bunch of pollen is going to get stuck to its face. When the hummingbird goes to the next flower, it's going to drop off all that pollen, and so the flower gets pollinated. That's a plus. And like I said, the hummingbird gets lunch. How about here? What's going on here? So this is an ant. And growing out of the ant, out of the head of the ant, is this fungus. So this fungus is what we call zombie ant fungus. So the fungus infects the ant, starts growing out of its head, kind of controls the ant's body. The ant, because it has this fungus taking over its body, climbs up a plant, hangs upside down from a leaf, and then the fungal spores will pop out of this guy and fall down on more ants that will then get infected. Because the fungus does not kill the ant right away, it's not like the ladybug and the aphid. This is not predation. This is considered parasitism because we have a host that is slowly being fed upon by the parasite. It's not a kill and eat right away. So this is parasitism. The fungus has a positive. It gets that host to feed off of. The ant definitely is losing some nutrients and its brain to the fungus. What about this one? What is this? We see this here in Texas all the time. These birds are called cattle egrets. And these clearly are cattle, right? And so this one, we might be thinking mutualism, but the birds don't actually eat bugs off of the cattle. They hang around by the feet of the cattle and eat the bugs that jump out of the way when the cattle are moving. So when the cattle steps through the grass, bugs, grasshoppers, and whatnot will jump away from the feet of the cattle. The birds can more easily find the bugs when they're jumping around the cattle's feet. And so the birds, even though this guy is definitely hanging out, getting some sun up there, they're not eating bugs off of the cows, but they will eat bugs that are more easy to find when the cattle are moving around. So this one is another example of commensalism. This is commensalism because the birds have a benefit. They don't have to use as much energy to find their food. The cattle don't care. They're not getting a benefit from the birds, but they're also not being harmed by the birds. So this one is kind of gruesome. Feel free to look away. Please, please, please make sure that your dogs get their heartworm medicine. This is definitely a parasite. It's kind of a horrible, terrible parasite. They are literally worms that grow in the blood system of your dogs. They hang out in the heart of your dogs. It's terrible and horrible. Make sure that you get your dogs their heartworm medicine. Okay, let's not look anymore. Good. Heartworm medicine. It's a must. Do it, my friends. Ecosystems. Next vocabulary word. Ecosystem. So we talked about species, groups of organisms that can interbreed. We talked about populations, the same species in the same place at the same time. We talked about communities. Communities are the groups of populations in the same space at the same time that interact. So those populations do interact with each other. That's a community, but they also are going to interact with their abiotic environment. Abiotic means non-living things in the environment like air and water and soil and rock, minerals, all the stuff that we need that don't come from other living things. This is going to be an ecosystem. So the community, all of the populations of all the living things, and then the non-living things in the environment, those interactions refer to ecosystems. Biotic is living, abiotic, that prefix a means without life, non-living. So we get our inorganic nutrients. Inorganic means not made by living things. Inorganic nutrients are always going to come from the abiotic environment. Sometimes those inorganic nutrients are obtained by one organism and turned into organic nutrients that then are passed to other organisms. But those inorganic nutrients, those starting things, are always going to come from the abiotic environment. Carbon from carbon dioxide, hydrogen and oxygen also in carbon dioxide, hydrogen and oxygen in water. These are all considered inorganic compounds, nutrients. Nitrogen, phosphorus, we're going to, in our living bodies, we're going to use nitrogen and phosphorus nutrients and turn them into organic compounds. But a lot of those guys start as inorganic nutrients. Some living things will turn them into organic compounds, or use them to form organic compounds, and then those can be passed on to other living things. There are 15 other elements in addition to these guys, but these ones are our most common ones. I could probably throw some sulfur in here. We definitely have lots of sulfur in protein. So these are our nutrients. Interestingly, nutrients are recycled. So we have lots of cycles, nutrient cycles. Energy, however, energy flows, and we'll talk about that in our next lecture. So those nutrients and the energy that we obtain from the environment and from each other, these are obtained through different modes of nutrition, and nutrition can be either autotrophic or heterotrophic. These help us determine our trophic levels. So that word troph, root word troph means nourishment. And so if you are autotroph, you are a self-nourisher, you feed yourself. Hetero is different, coming from someplace else, so we're going to have something else feed us. Autotrophs make their own food. Again, that's self-nourishment. They're going to use CO2 or some other kind of inorganic compound to get the carbon, and then they're going to make those organic carbon compounds, the sugars, the nucleotides, the lipids. They're going to make those themselves from those inorganic compounds, carbon dioxide, water, other stuff. We are heterotrophs. We are other nourishers. We have to get our nourishment from other organisms. We're going to obtain our organic carbon compounds from other organisms. We eat salad. The plants in our salad, they were the autotrophs. They made the food, and then we just stole it from them. Trophic levels can also be diagrammed in these amazing food webs. So here we have our autotrophs. These guys are photosynthesizers. They are making their own food. These guys are heterotrophs. We sometimes also call them consumers. We sometimes call our autotrophs producers. These guys are not making their own food. They have to eat something else. The arrows in our food web always point in the direction of the nutrient flow. So nutrients will go from the grass to the mouse. We're going to call the grass a primary producer. It's going to be our first trophic level. The mouse is going to be what we call a primary consumer. It's in the second trophic level, but it's a primary consumer. The snake is going to be 1, 2, 3, third trophic level up, but we're going to call it, if the mouse was a primary consumer, this guy is a secondary consumer. And then our hawk, because we're going 1, 2, 3, this is going to be a tertiary, I started writing tertiary consumer. Trophic level number 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Good, good. So these trophic levels, again, you're either an autotroph or a heterotroph, or you're super cool and you're both. So these guys, Euglena, they live in ponds. They do have chloroplasts. They are photosynthetic. They can make their own food. But if they are living in an area where there's less sunlight, they can also find little dollops of food. Let me find a better color here. Little dollops of food in the pond, and then they can do some endocytosis and gobble up the food, so they can be both heterotrophic and autotrophic because they're so cool. So as heterotrophs, we do feed on other living organisms. Us consumers are always going to ingest things. Ingest means that we put the food into our bodies. So decomposers are like consumers. They're feeding off of other living things, but not all of them are going to ingest the whole entire food stuff. Instead, they might do some external digestion, which is super cool. So detritivores are going to feed on detritus. Detritus is simply dead leaves, dead parts of animal bodies, feces, whatever stuff is laying around that's starting to decompose. Those decomposers, detritivores, are going to actually eat the detritus and then digest it on the insides of their body. So this is how they're going to consume, how they're going to be a heterotroph. They are going to eat dirt, digest all the cool stuff in the dirt. So this is how I remember detritivore. Detritivores dig in the dirt and digest the dirt, lots of D's. That's different from saprotrophs. Saprotrophs are super cool. They're going to feed on dead organic matter by external digestion. Saprotrophs are going to secrete enzymes outside of their bodies. Those enzymes will decompose, break down the detritus, and then the saprotroph will absorb those nutrients. You can imagine that they are sucking up the nutrients that were released during that digestion outside their bodies. So how remember saprotroph? Saprotrophs secrete the enzymes and then they suck up or absorb the nutrients after digestion occurs outside their bodies. Good? Good. So next up, I want you to decide if these decomposers are detritivores or saprotrophs. What do you think? These are bacteria, E. coli. Bacteria are good decomposers. Do you think they put dirt into their mouths and digest inside their bodies? That doesn't make any sense, right? They don't have a digestive canal. These guys are oh, that's a bad color right there. These guys are saprotrophs. These are saprotrophs. They're going to secrete enzymes outside their body. They secrete enzymes outside their body. Whatever happens to be outside their body, they're going to get decomposed, and then the bacteria will absorb the nutrients that are released after that external digestion. How about this earthworm guy? What do we think he is? Saprotroph or detritivore? He is a detritivore. And the reason is it's going to dig in the dirt and eat the dirt and digest the dirt inside its body. It is a detritivore. Whoa, I spelled detritivore wrong. Good. How about next two examples? What do you think this guy? Oh my gosh, one of my favorite organisms. This, my friends, is a dung beetle. It is a dung beetle. Dung is another word for poop. So dung beetles will literally gather poop from the environment and roll it into these amazing balls, take it back to their colonies to feed off of. They eat poop. Do you suppose they are saprotrophs or detritivores? They are detritivores. Dung is a kind of detritus. They are going to dig into the poo and then eat the poo and digest the poo inside their bodies. They are detritivores. How about fungus? These mushrooms, detritivore or saprotroph? Do funguses have fungi? Do they have mouths? Do they eat the dirt? They don't. So they are saprotrophs. They are going to secrete enzymes outside their bodies underground. So they secrete the enzymes underground, decomposes that detritus underground, and they're going to absorb those nutrients after external digestion. These guys are saprotrophs. All right, let's talk about nutrient cycles. We are almost done, my friends. Nutrient cycles. So inorganic nutrients, our supply is maintained by these amazing nutrient cycles. This is an example of the nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen cycle, we take N2, nitrogen gas from the air. We've got some super cool bacteria that help to turn those that nitrogen into either ammonium or nitrates, and then the plants can use the nitrates to form proteins, to form nucleic acids, and then us consumers eat the plants, and that's how we get our nitrogen. But it always starts here with that N2. We have to have that bacteria in order for us to be able to access it in the form of nitrates. Carbon cycle, we're going to talk a lot about this in a couple more lectures. This is basically photosynthesis and respiration, some combustion, some decomposition, and how we turn carbon dioxide into sugar, and then we turn those sugars into other like fossil fuels, and how we turn those back into carbon dioxide. water cycle. This one is evaporation, precipitation, that movement of water in the water table and ponds and whatnot. Phosphorus cycle, pretty similar to the nitrogen cycle, but this one is just that phosphorus that we need for our DNA. So to wrap up, put things into an important perspective, back to our essential understanding for the day, the continued survival of living organisms, including us humans, depends on a sustainable communities, us being sustainable with other organisms and with our environment. Being sustainable, renewable, depends on nutrient availability, depends on detoxifying waste products, and this is where us humans don't do a very good job. And then also energy availability. Sustainability is hard because we need to consider not just the environment, but also us humans and our social needs, the ecological needs of us and the organisms that we interact with, and then the economy of being a prosperous society. All of those things lead to things being viable and bearable and equitable, and trying to find where everything works together is how we get to sustainable, which is, I don't know, I think maybe sounds easier than it is. Like, look, it's just a little Venn diagram. We can do it. It's a big, complex problem that's going to require big, complex solutions. And I'm so glad that you all are brilliant and ready to take on those challenges of making our world a little bit more sustainable. And on that note, we did it. We defined all those vocabulary words. I am not going to repeat them all. We talked about all those words. We talked about that quadrat sampling. We're going to do a mock quadrat sampling lab in class. We talked briefly about this nutrient cycles. Good work, my friends.